19th century author Emile Zola said, "We're all like books. Most people only see the cover, the minority read only the introduction, and many believe the critics." In this episode of Brooklyn Savvy, we're going to begin conversations on deconstructing race. We're going to tell the stories about African American people, which is tangled in a history of racial mixing. I wanted to create a safe space to have uncomfortable yet transformative conversations that move people, amplifying the voices of those who are underrepresented and who inspire positive change. I'm Toni Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Well, Brooklyn Beyond, you know we're going to be deconstructing race today, but we want to talk about a startling stat. And I'm going to toss this one to you, Teresa. 35% of African American males have paternal lines, paternal European lines. What does that mean exactly?
What it means is that 35% of African American men can trace the origins of their paternal line to Europe. And that is an indicator of the effect that the transatlantic slave trade had on us as a people. So when you consider that when I say African Americans, I'm also including those throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America, we're considered to be a diasporic people, meaning that a percentage of our genome is European, African, and may in fact be Native American as well.
So I want to talk a little bit more about race and what it means. When we talk about race as a social construct, we say that race is a social construct, and that means it's not biology or genetics, but it's more about society and history and what we're shaped to believe.
Well, what we call race doesn't exist at all, and you're correct. We are all of the human race. Every human being alive can trace their origins, if you go back tens of thousands of years, to Africa. But what people conflate or consider race to be, there's no such thing. It's in fact only a biological adaptation to an environment. There's no biological fact that you can associate with race, the construct of race. It's a social construct that people established in order for some people to be considered more worthy than others, period.
Oh, that's interesting.
It doesn't exist. By the same token, issues of black blood, issues of indigenous blood, or white blood, no such thing. Blood is blood. So, but I want to get...
How can you, then when we say someone has Native American, what does that mean? How do we, why, is there a marker? I mean,
well, yes, there are. If you're talking strictly DNA, you have autosomal DNA tests that will give you the percentage of sub-Saharan African DNA, the percentage of European, and the percentage of Asian Native American. But do not conflate DNA with culture. That culture is what makes you you. It's a way of life. Whether it's your oral history, your singing, it's a way of life. No DNA test is going to give you a percentage and that's what you are. And getting back to the percentage of African American men who have European haplogroups, again, whether it's Y DNA, which is the paternal line, or mitochondrial DNA, which is the maternal line, though that's what we consider to be deep ancestry, it goes back tens of thousands of years. So you might take a test and get a haplogroup, whether paternal or maternal. That is tracing one line of your family tree, but who you are, you might not be what your original ancestor was. For example, my maternal line, my great-grandmother was half Irish, her mother's Irish. So my maternal line is European, but am I European? You have to be careful with that because haplogroups are deep ancestry. They may or may not reflect what you are culturally.
And people migrate and move too. So
Right,
what does it really mean? They're moving.
Right, but again, DNA is not culture. Culture is what makes you you. If you ask me what my culture is, I will tell you. Yes, I know my maternal line is triracial, but we were raised African American. I will tell you that my paternal line is triracial, but we were raised as Boricua people. If you are to say that you are descended from someone, the best proof is DNA cousin matching.
Excellent, excellent. Now, Robin, we've done a lot of talking about this. We've done a lot of talking about genealogy. What do you think is driving African Americans to really want to dig into this?
I don't think there's just one story or one reason why African Americans are interested in genealogy. I can say for myself, it was always trying to find the missing piece of the puzzle, the piece of the puzzle that I didn't learn in school, or the piece of the puzzle where people told me, you know, because of the transatlantic slave trade, there's only so much further back that I can go. So for me, it's, as a social justice, you know, person, it's reparative. It's how can I make these connections? How can I find these ancestors that I wasn't supposed to find, right? That there wasn't a way for, you know, my people to be able to stay together, you know, because families were torn apart and families were ripped apart, and some people thought that that was the end of our story. But, you know, through, you know, genealogists and other community members, through records, through learning from so many people, through cousin matches, as Teresa mentioned, I'm able to bring the family back together. And I think that's probably what is the most healing aspect of this work, is to say these people were supposed to be lost to me.
Yeah, the
like
reparative
forever.
piece.
Yeah, the
Right,
reparative piece.
right.
And even though, like, for me, like, I was able to get back to, you know, my fourth great grandmother, who was born in 1766 in North Carolina. But then I think about it, you have like 64 fourth great grandmothers. So there's like 63 other fourth great grandmothers whose stories I don't know yet, right? So when we talk about this is our history, it's like you might know this one story, but there's so many stories. And I think that's the kind of like addictive nature of genealogy. You're always trying to find your people. The kind of research you have to do as an African American family researcher, the records aren't always where they should be. You have to use all these creative means to get this information, and you build this really incredible community doing it. So it's just been such a rewarding experience and a healing experience.
I love the healing piece of it, because my family of origin is together, and of course beyond that, you know, you not forget the pain of the families being torn apart. I'm going to come to you now, sister girl. You know, we know some of our family history, because when we would go and visit our grandmother, she would spend a lot of time with this oral history that in some instances we didn't know if it was true. We thought it might be a myth. We didn't know, you know. So talk to us about the journey that you went on in terms of unpacking the family and some of the pain and joy.
I love what you all are saying, because I essentially just synthesized that information and said, okay, I don't see myself as a genealogist per se, but I see myself as taking that information and applying it to our situation. Right. My sister and I shared the story, or had a story, of an ancestor who was the superintendent of the Citadel, the 8th superintendent of the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And I just thought, and I decided to really actively pursue this during that whole George Floyd piece, because I said, you know something, we need to kind of deconstruct race and see ourselves as a part of each other. And so it became really a passion for me to make certain that that information was verified. So what I did essentially was I went to, well, the first thing I did was I went to the Citadel and spoke to some people there. And I went through the archives, found a good bit of information about him. And then from going to the archives, I decided later to speak to a committee. It was the committee who was studying slavery. And the beautiful thing about that was that there was a black scholar. She was an African-American history scholar. And I said, this is my opportunity because I won't be erased. I won't have to feel apologetic. I can just go straight in. So I spoke to Dr. Knight, and Dr. Knight essentially told me, you're going to have to get some DNA. You're going to have to get some evidence. And I thought, okay, how am I going to do that? And so through time, I kind of serendipitously,
The universe.
Yeah, I Googled Asbury Coward's name, and there his direct descendant had just passed away. He had an obituary in the Baltimore Sun. And interesting enough, both of us were naval officers. In fact, his brother, Curtis, who was his survivor, one of the survivors, was a naval officer at Annapolis. And so I said, wow, this man just died. I've got to reach this next man real quick. So I found his email address, and I kid you not, within 24 hours, he got back in touch with me.
And what did he say?
Well, what basically happened, I just said to him, I said, look, we share an ancestor. I believe we share an ancestor. And I did it
Was he responsive?
Yes, I did it in a very positive way because I said my Aunt Charlotte McFall Lacey was proud of this and took me to the Citadel, and she used to stand by his picture and say, look, I have his features, I have his nose. But I did that to kind of bring him in. And so sure enough, he wrote me back and he said to me, you're not going to guess what the M stands in my middle name, because his name was Curtis M. Coward. He said McFall. And I went, wow, so there is another connection there. And then through time and through Zoom calls, he basically said to me, I'll do whatever I can to help you verify it. And on Thanksgiving Day, he said, it's uploaded, my DNA is uploaded. Because there's a lot of rigmarole you have to go through. And so when I went home, sure enough, we matched. We had the same great-great-grandfather. And I did this basically because of my nieces and nephews. Yeah, and as an African American, I said, you know something? I knew African Americans who knew people who were enslaved. It's just that close in our memory. This is real. And I knew these people who knew the people I was researching. My nieces and nephews, they don't know them, and I thought, I got to do this. So there will be an essay. The essay will be published with the University of South Carolina, and it's going to be on the worldwide access. Everybody has access.
I wanted to cut in and say something in response to Robin and Tommy, because both of you have said what I just did a webinar about, and it's the ability of us not only to tell our stories, but to tell them publicly, to educate the students, and then write about it. Because I also just published 2 articles on a topic called Repairing Erasure, Indigenous Identity and Paper Genocide, that discusses not only how my ancestors were erased on paper because they were Afro-Indigenous, and people looked and made judgment calls because they were phenotypically black, but culturally they were indigenous. But I also want to say, you're very brave in reaching out to European DNA cousins the same way, because I reached out to a European DNA cousin in September because I noticed she had a black patriot ancestor whom I matched, and I also matched 7 other people who had descended from the same person. Come to find out, we're 5th cousins. And she never knew, but her ancestors are also Afro-Indigenous.
Can I ask you about erasure, though? If we were erased, then how do you find us? You're probably speaking about it differently, but if we're completely erased, how would we be able to find our
We aren't.
Documentation.
Yeah, right.
We aren't. I mean, I could
Right.
tell you, I could jump in a little bit here, because one of the reasons why my family has been very fortunate to know about one line back to the 1700s is because of the will of George Golphin the first.
A will. That's interesting. That's interesting.
A very extensive.
Tell us about this will here.
A very extensive will, where this was a man who came from a poor linen weaving family in Northern Ireland, Antrim Island, and he made a name for himself as a fur trader with the indigenous people, and became eventually very wealthy. And
American dream.
right, and he married into the Creek Nation because that's the way
political alliances.
That was the way the world was back in those days, where you could not do business with the indigenous people unless you were part of their community. So he ended up being given first. Chucky, which was his first wife, and then the second wife was given to him because he had risen so high in his status that the chief of the nation said, we need to give someone to you that is equally yoked with you. And he had another wife, and of those two wives he had several children, and one of the children that he had with the daughter of the head woman of the Creek Nation, and her name was Toni, was my sixth great grandmother. And he was my sixth great grandfather. And his will, which is very extensive.
How did you find
Well,
the will?
you know, we were very fortunate. There was a woman by the name of Isabel Vandervelde in South Carolina who wrote and did an incredible amount of research about George Golphin and his mixed race family. And it was a very extensive mixed race family because he had two Native American wives. And then during those days, even though they had Native American wives, they knew the legal system would not allow them to pass their assets along to these Native American wives. And so they ended up marrying and having a white wife on the other side.
This is complicated.
Because they had different rules back then, and sometimes they didn't have any rules. But long story short, because it's a very long story about George Golphin.
You said 1700.
He was one who, first of all, he loved his family, he loved his mixed race family, and he did not care who the baby's mother was. And I'm going to say that properly because sometimes I say the baby mama's mother. But he didn't care who the baby's mother was, but he made sure that all of his children and all of his grandchildren were on his will. And he went a step further and made sure that his daughters, who were of mixed race, received land under his will, which back in those days, women were not allowed to own land, but he made it legal.
And you
because,
speak of context, yes.
Yes, but he made it legal because he put it in the will. And so it was the will, getting back to your question, that really helped us to unpack and then do a lot more research to provide enough evidence to show that I was linked into that family.
And there's something else that you're linked into now, which is the Daughters of the American Revolution. Talk to us about that particular journey and that organization and how you've intersected. I'm using the word intersection with that.
Infiltrated? No. Let me stop.
That's okay.
No, the daughters are great. But I must say that in my research, because there was a lot of curiosity in the family about this George Golphin, we've been doing family reunions like a lot of families have been doing. And there was a lot of curiosity about George Golphin. We had this Isabel Vandervelde book, and I started Googling George Golphin. And every time I Googled his name, loads and loads of information came up. And one day I came across this Journal of the American Revolution about George Golphin being an unsung hero of the American Revolution. And I said,
He just did a lot.
I said, oh my God. I'm like, who is this man? And so I read the whole article. Then there was another article about him. And I said, okay, so now if he's an unsung hero of the American Revolution, my great grandmother was Amanda Golphin, who, you know, her father was my third great grandfather. And oh my gosh, if I'm related to him, then that must mean I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. And that's how the epiphany came to me. And then one day you I told you my story, and you said, well, you need to talk to Wilhelmina Rhodes Kelly. Yeah. And I didn't know who Wilhelmina Rhodes Kelly was at the time, but there was one day that I was fortunate enough to sit across the table from her sister. And she said, you know, I've been looking for a place for my group to meet. And I said, well, what's the name of your group? Linda Jones group. And she said, my group is the Daughters of the American Revolution. I said, oh my God, where have you been all my life?
And isn't that interesting how the universe gets us all to connect that way, right?
Yes.
No, that's a wonderful story.
Yes, and unfortunately, I did not get a chance to meet Wilhelmina Rhodes Kelly because she, very shortly after I met Linda, unfortunately, we lost her. She passed away.
But she left a legacy.
And she was helpful with us.
She was helpful with us
And
as well.
Linda was there with me, and just saying, you know, we have to work with you to get you in. But I could tell you that the process was very vigorous.
Vigorous, yes.
And you had to provide
Mildly.
legal documentation.
Right.
You had to provide proof. And when I talk about proof, it had to be legal proof. Either it couldn't be anything in the census, because I did the census research. But it had to be wills, it had to be land records, it had to be birth records, death records, maybe some articles, but you had to have proof, and you had to have scholarly articles as well, which we had.
Excellent.
Because there was some scholarly written material that has surfaced, and our genealogist actually connected with the scholar who testified on behalf of my application.
So look at how much work it is for us, Teresa.
Right,
I want you to be this
Doris-
way, Teresa.
And I'm part of Doris and Linda's legacy because I am in the process of vetting my 5-time great-grandfather, Samuel Freeman, say his name.
Samuel Freeman.
Amen, amen, amen. But it's the documentation that, you know, it's getting these documents, and as Doris said, there's just so much information that
It's a little overwhelming, hey?
it is overwhelming, but there is information out there. Sometimes, in my case, you know, I'm vetting a Black patriot, born circa 1750. So the only thing I need to prove now is a date associated with him. And so I have the same registrar as Doris, and God willing, Alyssa will find the information. But you know, it's important, again, that we speak out and let people know that we have ancestors who made this country what it is today.
I love what you just said. Yes, we made this country, and we made this country great. Thank you, Teresa. And thank you, Robin. And thank you, Doris. And thank you, Tommy, Brooklyn and beyond. We'll see you next time on Brooklyn Savvy.
My name's Alexander Williams. My real question is, as a Black man, if you had a Y haplotype that is traced back to Europe, as a man, we know that the Y haplotype is traced from father to son, father to son. Doesn't that kind of complicate how I would identify my race and my culture if down the line one of my ancestors was indeed a white man, whether it was a slave owner or a sharecropper or even a sailor? Doesn't that really complicate what my history would look like? As a second question, I'd like to ask, as an African American, we have a lot of race or culture that's tied to other groups other than Black. So can we really just not look at the fact that we're mixed? We do have white. That's a part of our history as well. As much as the Black men and the Black women were in our family, there's also white men and white women that were in our family. So how do we look at those ancestors and look at them almost fairly, because it's hard to look at them fairly because they were involved with slavery, which is a monstrosity. It's a big issue. But they were also products of their time. So how do we look at both groups and try to keep it as fair as possible, understanding that at the end of the day, both groups help to create us?
There's a lot to that question about the white ancestor piece. And I think as I've been doing my studies, that was hard because we were pitted against each other. But the one word, and I know this will sound sentimental, I think we have to start to see love as a political force, and that we have to harness that power. So as I studied Asbury, I took that man and I made him my screensaver because I wanted to develop a relationship with him. And I spent days just kind of gazing into his eyes. And when I first saw his picture, I could not hate him. I couldn't. Why? My grandmother looked exactly like him. So I don't want to give us a pass on any of this, but I do want to acknowledge that we are a part of each other's lives, and that is a particular challenge, that it's almost like one of those day-to-day things that you've got to work through.